Hi, in this episode we'll implement backup API for Ages. Now that we know what we want to get from the server, that shouldn't be a problem. But first, we need to be sure that Angular makes request to backend API to get this Ages data. So we need to write a test again. And we'll see how to use HTTP mock provided by Angular to mock actual Ajax communication. So let's go to ages.js controller spec. And first of all, here in before each, where we inject dependencies, let's inject HTTP backend. And that's the mock of HTTP. So to mock this, we will create HTTP and we make it as HTTP backend. And then we can actually make when get. And that simply means that when we have get request to API edges, we want to mock it and to respond with something like a response. Okay, so now let's create this simple response, and that's going to be just an array because we expect that Ages will return an array of objects and a simple object with, for example, key, hello. Okay, so now let's add these variables here, HTTP and response. Also, when we work with HTTP backend, it's a good idea to make sure that there are no leftovers like pending requests after each test. And for that, we need to define after each block, that's going to be a function. And inside of it, we want HTTP to verify no outstanding expectations and verify no outstanding request. Okay, so now let's create our example. So our example is like this. It makes request to API to fetch edges. So here, before each example, we actually mock in HTTP and we create in here mock for API edges get request. And we expect this request to happen when the controller instantiates. So HTTP, and we expect get request to API /edges to happen. And then we actually need to flush HTTP. So that will simulate the HTTP request. So as we added HTTP to our tests, we need actually to add this HTTP flush to every test that we have here. Okay, let's save the test and let's go to terminal and run karma start. And of course we fail because there are no pending requests to flush. There are no HTTP requests there. So to make it pass, let's go to our Ages service ages.js file, where we have this mock query object. And I'm going to remove everything from here and replace it with very simple thing. I inject resource module. Also, I change service to factory. And I return resource, which points to API edges, like this. Okay, so this way we created edges factory or edges service, and it is a resource which points to API edges. So now when I save it, and now I go to controller edges, here in this line, we actually making a query request to the server. So if we go back to terminal, you can see that now we are green. So this request is actually fired. Okay, let's go back to our test. And the second example will make sure that it assigns response data to Ages. So we could make this thing pass if we simply make only Ajax request like this without assigning. We're still passing, but this one, of course, is not. So if I go back here and I make HTTP flush, save it, go back, and now we're green. So what we want to do is to make sure that edges are actually equal to the response. So we expect that scope.edges, and we take the first parameter, so the first object, and key to equal hello. Save it. It, of course, fails. So let's go back and return scope.edges assignment. And we back to green. Okay, so this is basically how we test Ajax. We inject HTTP backend, we stub requests that we want and emulate some response against which we can make our expectations. And then we do not forget that after each example, we should verify that there are no outstanding expectations and requests. And then in examples, we whether expect that some request is fired, or we just flush in HTTP and then make our expectations. So now if we go to browser, so let's close Karma and run grunt serve. So here now, if I go to Ages, you can see that there is a request to API Ages. Excellent. So now we are ready for a backend. And we'll start from tests. We need to be sure that this API Ages request is actually available and responds with status to 100. And that's the easy controller test. So I'm going to Savage Worlds backend application, and I go to spec, and here I'm going to create folder controllers, and inside of it, edges controller spec.rb, and I need to create this directory. Okay, so here I require spec helper, and let's describe API edges controller. Let's save it, go to terminal, and run our spec controllers edges controller spec. So we do not have a constant API even. So to make this simple test pass, we need to go to routes, and inside of this route, let's create a namespace API, inside of which we will have the resources edges. And we know that for now, we only will have index action. Let's save it. So now we need to create in our application controllers, we're going to create new folder API, and inside of this folder, let's create edges controller.rb. And again, I need to make folder. And here, let's define module API. Let's save it, go back, and run our spec again. And now we can't autoload constant API edges controller, which we expect in edges controller.rb. So let's go back and create class edges controller, which inherits from application controller. Let's save it, go back, run specs, and now we're green. Excellent. So now we can get back to our spec. So let's describe get index. And inside of it, it responds with 200 status. Very easy, standard example. So we get to index, and then we expect that response.status to equal 200. Save it, run spec, and fail, because we do not have index action. So let's go back to our controller, let's define index, save it, run spec again. Now we do not have template, but we know that we actually don't want to have any templates. We want to render JSON, but for now we'll just return render nothing true. Let's save it, go back, run spec, and we green again. Excellent. So now let's make sure that we actually fetch edges. And for that, we actually need models. We need to create 3 models: edge, requirement, and category. Edge has many requirements and belong to one category. So let's do this. As we already know what kind of data we want, that's very easy to do with the help of Rails generators. So let's generate model edge, and it has name, description as text, and category as reference. Okay. The next model is requirement, and it has name, value, and mode. And the last one is category, which just has name. Okay, now we just make rake db migrate and rake db test prepare. Good. So now that we have that, we need to create JSON representation of these models. So we need to add active model serializers to our gem file. So let's go back and open gem file, and right here let's add gem active model serializers, and let's save it. go to terminal and run bundle. Now with active model serializers installed, let's generate serializers. With Rails, generate serializer, edge, requirement, and category. So now let's edit them. So let's start from edge serializer. And by default, it has only attributes like ID, but we also have name, we have description, we has one category, and has many requirements. Now let's open requirement serializer. And here we have name, value, and mode. And let's open category serializer. And here we have just name. Also, let's go to edge.rb model, and here you can see that it belongs to category, but also it has many requirements. Okay, so now let's go back to our controller test. And let's describe another example, and each response with JSON representation of an object. So first of all, we need to create category, and that's going to be just a category create with name category. And also we need requirement, as requirement create with name rec, value val, and mode rank. And next, let's create edge itself. So we do edge create, and we'll have name, we'll have description, category, and requirements. Okay, so now when we have all of these things in database, we can actually get to index, and let's get parsed JSON. We parse response body, and then we expect that parsed first element and category and its name to equal category. So basically we create some records in database like category, requirements, and age, and then we expect that when we visit index action, it actually will return JSON with this category, for example, in the age with the name of category. Let's save it and let's run our spec. So we have an error, can't write unknown attribute age ID, and that happened because when we created our model for requirement, I forgot to add the reference to age. So let's fix this. So here in migration for requirements, let's add reference to age. And now let's go back to terminal and let's run command rake db drop and then rake db migrate. Okay, and now rake db test prepare. And now let's run spec again. Okay, now it's better. A JSON text must at least contain 2 octets, so we do not have anything actually. So let's go back to our controller, and to make it pass, we just, instead of rendering nothing, we render JSON, and we fetch all edges, but our Angular application does not expect root element. So if I save it and run spec again, you'll see that we have a problem here, and this happens because Rails, by default, the active model serializers, has this root element instead of just returning an array of objects. So to fix this, just specify root false. And now if we run our spec, we're green. Great! Okay, in this episode, we created 2 kinds of tests. First was the front-end test, which tests that our Angular application actually makes requests to the server. And the second type of test is for the backend, which tests that server gets the request and responds with JSON representation of the edges collection. So in the next episode, we'll create end-to-end test with the help of Capybara and test all the functionality that we created so far, working together with front-end and back-end applications. So thank you very much for your time, and see you in the next episode.